I confess it, I admit it, but still is there no means of seeing what is in the cards? Yes, scripture and the rest, etc. But my hands are tied and my mouth is shut. I'm forced to wager and I'm not free. I have not been released, and I am made in such a way that I cannot believe. What then would you have me do? This is true. But at least that is your inability to believe comes from your passions. Since reason brings you to this conclusion, and yet cannot believe. Work then on convincing yourself, not by adding more proofs of God's existence, but by diminishing your passions. You would like to find faith and do not know the way? You would like to be cured of unbelief and ask for the remedy? Learn from those who were bound like you, and who now wager all they have. These are people who know the way you wish to follow, and who are cured of the illness of which you wish to be cured. Follow the way by which they began. They acted as if they believed, took holy water, had masses said, etc. This will make you believe naturally and mechanically. But this is what I'm afraid of. And why? What do you have to lose? But to show you that this is the way. This diminishes the passions, which are your greatest obstacles. That was the rest of the Discourse on the Machine. After the what is usually stopped at what's called Pascal's Wager. This is where Pascal goes from where we usually leave off with this: how do we make a decision? Well, we have to make a bet, right? So this partially explains why Pascal thinks that it is so important to make a choice. In part because we're bound to make a choice, right? Not making a choice amounts to a choice. But further, this tells us where he thinks we need to go from here. Right? We have a starting point, right? We can begin by making a choice. We have a method for making that decision. We have this pragmatic decision-making process. We have a way of choosing. We've determined that believing in God is a better practical choice than choosing not to believe. But the skeptic might go on and say, well, fine, that might be the case, but I just can't believe something that I don't have reason to believe. This is a very common response. Further still, Pascal even points out that we may have good logical reasons for believing, good argumentative reasons for believing. We might believe on the basis of arguments and still have trouble genuinely having psychological faith, say, to distinguish it from the theological virtue. We have trouble truly believing even if we're rationally convinced of something. And the reason for this, he points out, is that we are passionate creatures. We are creatures who are embodied. We're not pure abstract beings. We're not pure minds. We have bodies. We act in the world. Suppose you believe God exists. And suppose, in part, that is because you've been utterly convinced that one of the classical arguments for God's existence is true. Right? So you've studied the relevant evidence and you've come to a conclusion. Suppose you've taken a look at Anselm's ontological argument, or one of the more modern versions of it, and you've come to the conclusion that that than which nothing greater can be thought must exist in reality. Chances are, if you're a sane person, at least, or even a moderately well-adjusted person, you're not constantly thinking about that. Right? You're not constantly considering the ontological argument and the fact that it is sound, but even when you are doing things which are religious, which depend upon belief in God. What you're ordinarily doing is talking with your friends. You might be petting your cat. You might be spending time with family. You might be concerned about viral infection, to put a topical point on it. Right? All of these times, you're not utterly convinced by the ontological argument. Right? The ontological argument is at best there in the background. It's worth noting that elsewhere Pascal says that, well, a lot of these arguments, both the ontological argument, arguments from prophecy, cosmological arguments, that they're perfectly sound and they demonstrate that Christianity is true. However, He acknowledges that we're humans, right? And that even if these arguments are completely sound and they are demonstrative, that doesn't always help us. Because most of the time, even if they can demonstrate that God exists, most of the time we're not thinking about them, and therefore they are not demonstrating to us that God exists. At best, it gives us this initial impulse of what belief to choose to hold. It's at that point that we have to submit our minds, our passions, and ourselves to what he calls the machine, to believe in this natural and mechanical sort of way. Well, what is this? Well, he says, act as if you believed. Right? Act as if God really does exist. Ask yourself, well, if God existed, what would I do? And then he says, do that. Right? And the reason isn't just because he thinks it's the right thing to do. And maybe it is, but that's not the relevant consideration. His point here is that if we act as if God exists, we will start to believe that God exists in what he calls a natural and mechanical sort of way. Because by acting in a certain way, we will start believing what we are sort of pretending to believe. If you want to be cynical about this, you can call it a sort of fake it till you make it, or fake it until you really believe it sort of practice, right? Now, maybe that's uncharitable towards Pascal's point, but if we take this in a sort of charitable light, it kind of clarifies what he means, right? His point is not that that any given argument, whether his wager or any of the actual proofs of God's existence, if they are sound, it's that that none of those arguments are going to do the job of convincing us that God exists, and none of those are going to keep us sort of in the faith, if you will. And what's going to do that are well-established, practiced habits. It's not syllogisms that are going to get us to get up on Sunday morning and go to church, at least not typically. It's habit, it's practice, it's choosing to act as if you believe. And then what'll happen there is that you will then gradually come to believe. Now, there are two aspects of this. First of all, there's the purely psychological aspect, and then there's the more theological aspect. The psychological aspect is quite borne out. The more psychological research we do, the more we come to see that if you act in a certain way, you will conform your propositional beliefs to that action. Right? It's very difficult for us to simply choose to believe something, if that's even possible at all. But if we choose to believe something and then act upon that belief, we will start believing it. This comes back to the old, maybe urban legends, but partially based on reality, of how to fool a lie detector test or a polygraph, is you have to believe what you're saying. And part of that is to act as if it's true, whether that's in your mind or whether that's in reality. Because if you act as if something is true, then you're really going to start psychologically believing it. Your beliefs will conform to how you behave. Now, there is a potential problem with this, and the objector in the dialogue we read brings this up, and that this seems like a kind of self-deception, right? You're trying to almost trick yourself into believing something that you wouldn't otherwise believe. And Pascal says, yeah, it is, right? Because it's not your mind that you're tricking, it's your passions that you're tricking. It's the distractions of everyday life which would draw you away from what you've already rationally determined, whether metaphysically or pragmatically, to be the truth, right? It's not that you've come rationally to believe that something is false, but you want to believe that it's true, and so you fool yourself into believing that it's true. That's not what he's talking about, right? He's talking about once you've come to a rational conclusion, whether that's on the basis of a metaphysical demonstration, or whether that's on the basis of a pragmatic consideration like the wager, that you still have work to do. You still need to go about convincing yourself of actually believing it. And he says that's going to involve this kind of practical matter of acting as if you believed, and that is going to convince you of it, just psychologically speaking. On the other hand, there's the theological aspect, and he mentions sacraments and sacramentals, and that's because Pascal, despite some let's say theological divergences with the official church, is presumably and certainly was a faithful Catholic, and so he believed in the salvific power and the grace present within the sacramental life. So another part of the machine is allowing God to act. Because if you've chosen to believe in God and it turns out that you're right, if it turns out that you're right, then presumably acting as if you believed is not just going to have a psychological effect, but it's also going to diminish the parts of yourself, the passions, the distractions, and especially things like pride, that are going to be getting in the way of God acting within your life to grant the supernatural gift of faith. Right? The capacity to believe, the capacity to continue believing, even in the face of passions and obstacles. Right? What I mean by that, what I mean by passions, obstacles, particularly pride getting in the way, I like to use the thought experiment of a well-known atheist, say Richard Dawkins, who's made a career throughout most of his entire life about being a rational atheist and arguing against God's existence. He's built his entire career and his entire reputation, at least most of his career, and certainly his reputation, on atheism, on rational atheism. It seems that it would be very difficult, if not psychologically impossible, for Richard Dawkins to change his mind, especially publicly, given just the sheer amount of crow he would have to eat in that case, in admitting he had not only been wrong his entire life, but he had led millions of people astray for his entire life. Right? He would have to use the Christian term, repent. And that's not easy. It's a kind of death of one's self, at least one's vision of oneself. In order to truly change one's mind when one is so committed to something, part of oneself has to die. And we don't want that, right? We don't want that to happen. We have this self-image of ourselves which is solid, which is probably more important to us than most of us want to acknowledge. And so it would take a lot of humility, frankly, for somebody like Richard Dawkins to especially publicly change his mind. There's a lot of passion there and a lot of pride, which is getting in the way of decision making. Right? Decision making, in particular, about choosing what to believe. Right? And we can scale this down to our own little everyday lives too, right? That in order to change our minds, we'd have to admit that we had been wrong, and not only that we had been wrong, but that we had been wrong and have been doing things wrong for however long we've been doing them and we've been thinking in a certain way. So Pascal recommends the machine, right? This natural and mechanical way of getting yourself to believe, as the way of overcoming these passions and this, especially this pride. Because if you simply act as if you believed, what that means is you're going to be diminishing those passions. Because rather than the pride or the passion being the basis of your decision making, of what to do at moment to moment, you're making the conscious choice to act as if God exists and act accordingly. Right? If you're making that conscious choice, that's going to be diminishing, very gradually, but it will be diminishing those passions and that pride. And if you're right and God does exist, right, whether you know that based on rational demonstration or private revelation or religious experience or even just pragmatic decision making, if God really does exist, then we ought to hope that God is going to grant us the gift of faith. And that by diminishing our passions and diminishing our pride like this, we're getting out of both God's way in this sense, and we're getting out of our own way. We're removing the obstacles to genuine faith. Okay. So to wrap up, this is, as I mentioned, probably the far more important part of Pascal's Discourse on the Machine as compared to the Wager, what is typically read. And that's because Pascal's pragmatism, his overall pragmatic outlook at religious epistemology and the philosophy of religion generally, it isn't just about how to make the decision, it's how to act. Right? And it's how to get yourself to believe what you've come to conclude one ought to believe, whether that's simply because one's concluded that it's true, one has concluded that it's the right decision, however the case might be. Right? So Pascal's main point is not that one ought to choose to believe in God because there's a better positive outcome if you believe than if you don't believe. Right? That's just an example. Right? That is just one way that he thinks, well, you might be able to make the decision this way if you can't do it some other way. His key point is how to do that, is to act as if you believe, and then you will come genuinely to believe. Perhaps most importantly, this also overcomes the doubt that I mentioned in the previous video, that choosing to believe purely on the basis of wanting a certain reward and wanting to avoid a certain punishment seems disingenuous. And that's because it is, at least to a significant degree, disingenuous. But what the machine does, according to Pascal, is that it moves that bad faith decision into having genuine faith. It goes from merely a pragmatic decision, or merely even just a purely rational decision, which has no heart behind it, to use kind of Pascal's terms. It moves from there into genuine holistic faith because it convinces the whole self to believe, and not just the purely rational part, and not just the part which desires reward. But it convinces the whole self of, well, in this case, God's existence and the truth of the Christian faith, etc. All right, so that is, as I said, I think the most important part of Pascal's argument here, at least the most important part of his Discourse on the Machine. So with that, I will leave you until next time. Bye.